David King. He is the new principal of Robert F. Kennedy High School in Great Ridge, Illinois. Mr. King was born and raised in Great Ridge, Illinois. He was a middle school English teacher and also an assistant principal. He was hand selected by the Great Ridge superintendent to take over Kennedy High. He took over the most difficult middle school in the city. This is Mr. Jack Wise. He is the current principal of Robert F. Kennedy High School. He was formerly a superintendent, and he is the first principal of Robert Kennedy High School. He wrote a book on the house system, but was described as a broken man by David King. He resigned in disillusionment. Robert F. Kennedy is made up of 4 houses. Each house has 300 students, 18 faculty, and 1 housemaster. The first 2 years at Kennedy High were very chaotic. There was rivalry between the department heads and the housemasters regarding curriculum policy and who should do what. This led Mr. Weiss to create the free market policy, which allows the department heads to tell the housemasters what to do and vice versa. There were budget cuts, a teacher was assaulted, another one was beaten and robbed. Parents threatened to boycott if security measures were not put in place for their kids' safety as well as those of the teachers. But Mr. Wise did not agree with them. Due to the budget cuts, Mr. Wise was unable to hire teachers to replace the 8 teachers who had resigned. As a result, he needed to make changes to the housing system. He now required teachers from one house to teach in another house, which was not part of the norm. Mr. Carver, who disagreed with this, decided to reach out to the Great Ridge Times to report this as a violation to them. Other teachers and department heads and staff disagreed with him, saying it was a better idea. One of the assistant principals resigned, who was in charge of the staffing and the scheduling. As a result, that policy did not hold. Fights broke out here and there in the cafeteria. Again, the request was for security guards were made, but Mr. Weiss disagreed. Instead, he decided to close the schools, close the doors to the 4 houses, and leave only 1 door open. There continued to be more fights, and again, he closed the school to investigate while everyone came through the main door. And assigned the school a municipal police. Some were for that, some were against that, so that was canceled, and a police cruiser was placed outside the school instead. In King's first week, he used that week to interview staff. He started with Mr. Smith, his vice principal, who was somewhat interested in his job but didn't say so. He was actually offered a job elsewhere and declined it. Mr. Carver and Mr. Cheswick were against closing doors and felt like every door of each house should be opened. Mr. King liked Mr. Carver and wished every other housemaster could be like him. The other 2 housemasters did not really have an opinion on whether the doors should be open or not. However, Mr. Perkins, during the course of Mr. King's interview, he found that there was a letter circulating for the resignation or the firing of Mr. Perkins. They felt that he was incompetent and that he could not hold his house together and that somebody else should take it. However, Mr. Perkins, according to some people, was very loved. He just had some issues with his house in terms of they had like the most discipline issues, lowest attendance rates, and things of that sort. Mr. Crimmins, the history chair, advocated for Mr. Perkins, saying that he was a good asset to the school and that he should not be let go. And if for any reason he was let go, after all of that consideration, that he himself would quit if Mr. Perkins was to be let go. That was by the way. Mr. King talked through all his different interviews. Mr. Carver, he really liked him. He was very bright. Mr. Chesapeake was highly competent, but not very imaginative. Mr. Bonavato was smart. And of course, Mr. Perkins seemed sincere. He then later held a meeting that afternoon, asked if everyone was happy because they seemed to be happy, and that started a conversation because the question was about relationship between housemasters and department chairs. Mr. Crimmins suggested that maybe that should be said at another day. Miss Dula, the English department chair, did say she was not. She actually brought to the attention that the relationship was not good and that she was having some issues with Mr. Carver. She and Mr. Carver were going back and forth with each other, and at the end of the conversation, Mr. Carver said he was going to break her neck.